Okay, folks, so I am just going to call the meeting to order. This is the Standing Committee on Government Operations. My name is Julian Morse. I am the chair of the committee and MLA for Frame Lake. And we have the Office of the Language Commissioner delivering her annual report today in a few seconds. So I'll bring her on in a few seconds. First, I'll just get committee to do introductions. We'll start with Mr. Rogers this morning.
Hi there.
Oh, just wait for your mic, Denny.
Hi, thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Denny Rogers. I'm the MLA for Nuvik-Boot Lake.
Hi, good morning. My name is Kate Reed, MLA Great Slave.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Center. Happy to be here.
Good morning. My name is Richard DeJerick. I'm the MLA for Tunde Walidi. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Ms. Gauthier to deliver her comments on the annual report. So the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the Standing Committee on Government Operations for your time this morning to review the Office of the Language Commissioner's annual report for the year 2022 to 2023. As you're aware, I was appointed to the Language Commissioner role in January of 2021 for a 4-year term. I am currently in the final year of this term. The Northwest Territories has 11 official languages, and the annual report that we will be discussing today covers a 1-year period from April 1st, 2022 to March 31st, 2023. During this period, a review of the Official Languages Act and Bill 63 and an act to amend the Official Languages Act occurred. Minor changes occurred to the legislation at the end of this reporting period, March 2023, from Bill 63. These changes are: substitute changes were made throughout the document, changing the use of language throughout the document or throughout the legislation. Aboriginal was changed to Indigenous, and she was changed to they. The Language Commissioner must now be a resident of the Northwest Territories. And before this amendment, the only mechanism available was to investigate. Now there's the option to make a referral to alternative dispute resolution with each complainant's consent. The annual report is filed annually. The amendment now requires the report to include the number of complaints received by the Languages Commissioner, which government institutions were the subject of the complaint, which recommendations, requests, and applications were made by the Language Commissioners respecting each complaint, and a report on the progress made on the recommendation, requests, and applications referred to in paragraph C. The Official Languages Board and Aboriginal Languages Revitalization Board were merged and will continue as the Official Languages Board. The recommendations put forward as a result of the review of the Official Languages Act still require a response to the GNWT, and I won't go into those recommendations at this time. During 2022, the Bureau of Statistics released their report, which states there's a continued decline in Indigenous language speakers in the NWT. Inuktitut is the only Indigenous language that saw an increase in speakers. English and French remain strong in the NWT. Other highlights that occurred during this period are the numerous discussions with different language commissioners and ombuds in Canada regarding how to improve language provision in the NWT. Hearing best practices and discussing on ongoing issues supports what is occurring in the NWT and what is also occurring in other jurisdictions. I continue to have working relationships with territorial, federal, and international counterparts and organizations such as International Association of Languages Commissioners and the Forum of Canadian Ombuds to gain from existing knowledge on best practices nationally and internationally. I have previously met with the Francophone Affairs Secretariat, the Indigenous Language and Education Secretariat, and the Official Languages Board to get oriented to their programs. Plans are to reconnect with these organizations. As I understand, there have been some staff changes, and I would like to see how this would impact the programs going forward. In the 2022-2023 reporting period, there were no complaints investigated. There were verbal complaints put forward. However, due to the lack of response from the complainants, they could not be followed through. During this period, there was a lot of discussion regarding the lack of services in the Indigenous languages, and there were very valid concerns out there. Despite these discussions, there has not been any complaints for this office to follow through on. 3 recommendations were put forward in the annual report that I know you have reviewed. And I will go through those 3 recommendations at a high level. And the first one is that the Official Languages Board has a mandate in which they can review the status of all languages within government institutions. And I had recommended that this be actioned. And as far as I know, nothing has been done to evaluate the number of Indigenous and French and English speakers throughout government institutions and how their services are implemented. Another one is I really recommend that the Northwest Territories create a separate division that focuses specifically on Indigenous languages of the Northwest Territories, and I think that division should mirror the services provided by the Francophone Affairs Secretariat. And basically what that division does is provide advice and support to GNWT institutions and departments, develops orientation programs for French language service coordinators, coordinates French translation services for the GNWT, and liaises with the Francophone community. And they also ensure systematic audits of French language communications and services. So I do think that is something that the GNWT should be working towards. And finally, that the GNWT research and develop an assessment program for the 9 official languages to ensure that the language speakers are compensated for providing service in their language. The Indigenous speakers should also be informed of the bilingual bonus, and those who are eligible to receive this bonus are receiving the benefit. As things currently stand, there's little knowledge of this bonus and the service provision. And that basically concludes my presentation, and I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Gauthier. I will put it to committee for questions. I have Mr. Hawkins first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my question for the Languages Commissioner would be is to, knowing that the budget has significantly increased, could she elaborate or let us know as to what exactly the folks do there? The office has increased, as I mentioned, including the budget, so I'm sure it's more than just receiving complaints, so I'm curious as to what you folks are doing. Maybe if you could let us know. Thank you.
Thank you.
The legislation
Go ahead, Ms. Gauthier.
Thank you. Thank you. If you refer to the legislation, it's very restricted on the duties of the Languages Commissioner. Basically, the Language Commissioner follow up on complaints and promotes the office of the Languages Commissioner.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins for follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Respectfully, that didn't answer the question. So what do you guys, what has the office done in the last year? So if you investigated complaints, that would be one answer in the sense of if you could elaborate on that, although your statistics say 0. So I would like to hear about maybe how how your inquiries go. You said they didn't put it in writing or they were difficult to follow up. The second part of that option being, as you pointed out, to promote. I'd like to hear on what you've done to promote, maybe how many times you've spoken to people, gone to people, those types of things. I'm trying to understand what the office has done in the last year. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Gauthier.
Thank you. We've had a lot of informal discussions. We've really been trying to encourage Indigenous language complaints, also Francophone language complaints. When I had first started in this role, it was not an office that received a lot of complaints to begin with. And when I had started, I believe the number was 6 complaints annually, and they were all specific to COVID. Or not all, sorry, a majority of them were specific to COVID. Since COVID has come and gone, I don't find that I'm getting as much reaching out. What I am getting for complaints are so broad that I can't action them. And I have gone back to the complainants and asked for more detail, how to get the complaint where it's manageable, that I can investigate, but I'm not getting any response back. So, and that's why there has not been any complaints. In the meantime, what we've been doing is we've been trying to attend community events and talking to people one-on-one, talking to any group if they want us to. I've tried to meet with different leadership in the communities to try to inform them of the services. And a lot of these discussions, we do discuss very valid concerns. However, the complaints are not coming in. And I will not move forward with someone's concern if they're not willing to put it forward as a formal complaint. And that's basically, and it's part of my personal issue. I'm an Indigenous woman. I grew up with residential school and colonialism. And so when I'm dealing with other Aboriginal people, I do not feel like I have that right to take their voice away from them if they're not going to put in a formal complaint. There's very valid issues out there, and but I will not push those complainants forward if they are not willing to do it. We do have a lot of discussions. I hear very concerning things, and I do. I help where I can. I'll help redirect people. I'll get them information if I need to. Anything to help them move forward if they're not putting in the complaint. As I mentioned, they're not. So sometimes they want guidance on where to find translators, and they talk about the issues with the different programs that the government's offering. So we do try to help through different routes.
Okay, thank you. Over to Ms. Reid next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Gauthier, for joining us today. I'm just looking at the annual report and reading through the recommendations once more. I'm curious about recommendation number 6, which reads that the government of the Northwest Territories double funding for Indigenous language education services and revitalization. I'm just wondering if you could speak to the choice to make that was double the funding, just in more detail. I'm curious as to why that was a choice. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find that, but I think that's a recommendation that was put forward through the standing committee that completed the review of the Official Languages Act. That's not a recommendation that came from this office.
Ms. Reid?
My apologies, Ms. Gauthier. I misread that section. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reid. Do you have a follow-up question? Okay. Mr. Rogers, I believe you're next.
Thank you. Yeah, and my question actually, I think it may have been asked, but I'll follow up because again, I note that since 2017, there's been no Indigenous complaints, and I know you kind of talked about things we can do. Is there anything else that you think we can be doing or you can be doing to encourage people? And I respect that. Exactly, you don't want to take anyone's voice from them, but to ensure they're getting, if they do have a complaint, that they are bringing that forward.
Thank you to the Commissioner.
Thank you. This is not only an issue that's occurring in the Northwest Territories, it's occurring nationally and internationally where the Indigenous language speakers are not bringing those complaints forward. These are issues that I brought to different tables, and I've looked for different ways to try to support this. And it's a challenging situation across the board for numerous language commissioners. So the one thing that I feel that can make a difference, and I'm hoping will make a difference, is that we hear more language speakers provided and service provision in the Indigenous languages from government institutions. I know there's a lot of work going on with language revitalization. There's great work happening in the curriculums. However, my role as language commissioner is to watch service provision from the government institutions at the department, courthouse legislative assembly. And what I would like to see what I would like to hear is the Indigenous languages being offered. I really would like to hear more language use in government institutions. I would like to have the Indigenous language speakers recognized and compensated for their work, and that they be encouraged to speak their language in the workplace.
Thank you. Follow-up, Mr. Rogers? I have Mr. Hawkins next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question for the Commissioner is, how many meetings, presentations, speaking events, or even invitations to present at conferences have you been to during this reported year? And if you could provide us some examples of the advocacy work you've done. Thank you.
Thank you to the Commissioner.
Sorry, can you repeat that? Can you repeat that last part?
Can you provide us some examples of the advocacy work you've done? So I asked specifically about how many meetings, presentations, invitations, or speaking events you've attended, and if you could give us elaborate with some examples of advocacy work. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've met with different organizations, and I'm just trying to think. We've had invites from Parliament to speak on the Indigenous languages, which we provided. We met briefly, but we followed up in writing. I will attend different conferences where we're invited. A lot of it is, I will admit, it's me reaching out. We do get some invites to present, not very many. So when I know I'm going to be in any area, even on my own personal time on annual, if I know there's a language commissioner or a minister or another ombudsman around, I will take my personal time and meet with them to have discussions regarding service provision and different ways to promote offices. I do meet with the language commissioner for Nunavut. Our legislation is very different, but we do have discussions on the issues that are occurring in our jurisdictions. I've met with Ontario's French language commissioner, and basically some of these larger organizations, they do reach out to me to see how they could support us if they can. And if they want, they offer that we have some agreements in place if we need them. And there's just basically a lot of sharing best practices. I've tried to meet the executive directors if I can't meet with the board, just to let them know of the services out there. I've met with the Gwich'in Tribal Council CEO. I've met with Salt River First Nations Executive Director. I try to inform them of the services in the office, how I can support them if there's any issues. I do try to find out from them if they're encountering any language barriers for their membership. Other things that we do is we've attended the craft fairs where we know there's a large turnout. I don't have a big travel budget, so if I could get to an event where there's numerous communities coming in, I will try to have an information booth there to answer questions and to give out information as well.
Okay, thank you. Over to Mr. Hawkins does not have a follow-up question. Over to Ms. Reed for another question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to Ms. Gauthier. For your specific recommendations in the annual report, I apologize, I was reading the wrong page. Your first recommendation is that the official languages board be able to evaluate the administration and delivery of services by government institutions and departments in the delivery of service in all official languages, in particular the 9 Indigenous languages. It's my understanding that the official languages board is currently, all the positions are vacant, and I'm curious if this recommendation was actioned by government, would a GNWT review be sufficient, or would you prefer third-party review? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner.
Thank you. I would be happy with a government review as well, or either one, because right now there has not been a review, and I think that review needs to happen so we have an idea of how much Indigenous language speakers are out there, and how many are being asked to provide services or in their language, whether or not they're compensated for it. Because I do know that language speakers are often asked to come and interpret or translate for the public when they come in, and I don't think those services are being recognized, or even that person is being recognized for having those abilities. So I would be happy with either one.
Okay, thank you. No follow-ups from Ms. Reed. Do we have any further questions from committee for the Commissioner? Mr. Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, maybe just in the simplest form of, well, maybe a couple quick questions. Maybe one of them would be in an easy form, referring back to my previous question. Would the Languages Commissioner be able to provide us a summary of meetings and speaking events that she used to promote official languages? I'd be curious as to who the audience would be and who she's been speaking with. I mean, if this is one of the recommendations, of course, is to look at expanding the role, changing the roles. I'd be curious on the audience she's speaking to or who's receiving the information. So, yeah, anyway, start with that question. Thank you.
Thank you. To the Commissioner.
Thank you. That is provided on page 20 of the annual report. However, I do not list the one-on-one discussions. I do list agencies and organizations and higher level positions that I meet with. I do not list one-on-one people. But it is there. It's in the annual report on page 20.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you. So, yeah, I didn't have that appended to my current package. I'm now looking at it. I'll come back to that question in a second. The next question is, I think your budget was overspent by $20,000, and I was just curious if you had any comment with respect to that, as to what the issues were, what was the need, etc. So maybe if you could help explain some of that. Thanks.
Over to the Commissioner.
This is the first I'm hearing my budget is overspent. So if it is overspent, I shouldn't be. And if it is showing as being overspent, it was never brought to my attention. I work very hard to make sure I'm within my budget.
Sorry, Mr. Hawkins didn't hear what you said. Could you repeat what your answer, please, Commissioner?
Okay, sorry. This is the first I'm hearing that my budget is overspent. I work very hard to stay within my budget, so I'm not aware that I'm overspent. So I'm kind of surprised to hear this question.
Okay, thank you. To Mr. Hawkins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, maybe if it's possible to park this point, only because if the Languages Commissioner is not aware of it, and I'm going to assume she's correct, perhaps we should check our briefing note just to double check that our numbers line up properly as well, in all fairness, and that way we're all on the same page. So she could be correct, and it could be an addition error from the review of the report, etc. So I would say don't take that one personal. We'll go back and reaffirm our numbers, because the briefing note at this particular second, for transparency context, so the Languages Commissioner notes where the question was coming from. It has the appearance of being overspent by $28,000. So if this is unfamiliar territory in the sense of awareness or news, we'll follow up on our end just to make sure it's correct. I mean, it could have been an adding error on our part. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you. Do you have a follow-up, Mr. Hawkins?
Yeah, I think that I'll now that I've had the chance to glance at the that page on the report that, like I said, isn't appended to the thing. I was just curious, maybe. I was just curious as to where these meetings were and how they were performed. I like how you pointed out that the met with the Languages Commissioner via Zoom, the Canadian Language Commissioner via Zoom, and I was perhaps maybe for a request as opposed to putting you on the spot is you could let us know in a follow-up email or further tabling of information where those meetings were. So for example, you put, and I'll be very crystal clear so you'll know exactly what I meant, which is met with MP McLeod. Was that a phone conversation, video conversation? Did you come to Yellowknife? Did you go to Ottawa? Did he come to Fort Smith for a presentation? Things like that. So if you could elaborate on all of those, that would be fantastic, and submit that to committee in a timely way. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the Commissioner able to make that commitment?
Yes, I'll submit a follow-up with how and where these meetings occurred. I will also add whether or not I was traveling there on personal business as well.
Thank you. Are there further questions from committee for the Commissioner? Seeing none at this time, I will ask a few questions of my own. I noted, Ms. Gauthier, like in your presentation, you talked about kind of efforts to encourage complaints, but also not wanting to kind of overstep, and I totally sympathize with that and understand what you're saying. I guess what I'm asking here is, do you have recommendations for how your office could be better empowered to perhaps better achieve the mandate of the office, promoting language, Indigenous languages and the 11 official languages of the territory? Is there something missing that could perhaps make your role more effective?
Yes, it's the review of the legislation. If you look at the legislation, it's very clear on how restricted the language commissioner's role is versus the minister responsible for official languages. And my office is not to promote languages. And so it's very clear in the legislation. The minister responsible for official languages' role is to promote languages within the government institutions. So it's clear. It's very clear in the legislation. My role has been very restricted with the creation of the role of the minister responsible for official languages.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I guess this is sort of the same question being put again, but I just to kind of maybe encourage a bit more elaboration. Can you speak to any challenges you're having in fulfilling a stronger mandate in your office?
Regarding language promotion, just unclear.
Honestly, I'll just keep it an open question regarding anything under your jurisdiction.
My jurisdiction is to investigate and to promote my office. That is the only mandate I have. So I cannot go and start promoting languages. I know it's a very confusing role since I'm the languages commissioner, but it's very clear. And it was made very clear when I started this role that I cannot cross that line of language promotion.
Thank you. Sorry, we're just getting mics worked out there. Thank you for that answer, and your comments are noted on review of legislation. Another question I would bring is, why do you think there have been no Indigenous language complaints since 2017? Do you see this as a problem, and what, if anything, should be done to change this if you do see it as a problem?
I do see it as a huge problem because in my discussions, I know there's very valid concerns. We've offered to sit down with different people to help them write out their complaints, to just to find different ways to support them. We've tried to really push that we keep our complaints confidential as much as possible. We do not release names. We don't, even when we're investigating, we try not to use the complainant's names if we can't. We've done a lot of things. And even when the complainant hears that we confirm, that is a very valid concern. And I don't know if that's enough for them. I will admit that. I don't know if they just need to hear, like, okay, yeah, I'm right. I know there's something wrong. I should be provided services in my language, but we're really trying different ways to try to get those complaints to come forward, and they just aren't. And it's not something that we figured out. As I mentioned, I tried to talk to different counterparts across the board to look for ideas. And we just figure trying to build trust through our one-on-one communications, establish relationships that way. I really try, and we try different ways. So I'm stumped, and I know it's a problem. I know there's very valid concerns there. And I just keep trying to work on personal relationships and professional relationships and hope that someday I'll start to hear these complaints come forward.
Okay, thank you. I won't belabor the point, but it would be very interesting to see some recommendations on how this could change it. I mean, the fact that you're saying it's a significant problem is interesting. So I am curious to kind of investigate that a bit more. Moving on to a different question, and if committee members do have questions, please feel free to speak up. I don't mean to be taking up all the time here, but the 2021 census, results indicate a decrease in speakers in 9 of the 11 official languages in the NWT. What more can we do to support NWT's official languages? What do you think is the missing piece here? What do you think needs to change in order to support these languages growing or at least maintaining?
And I think this one could also be added to the last question that was just asked. I think service provision in the Indigenous languages. People need to hear their languages and feel that, okay, I hear it, they're not providing the service in that language. So I do think that the departments need to have one centralized location to go to get service provision, provide services in all the official languages. As I mentioned in one of my recommendations, the Francophone Languages Secretariat really supports the department, and they provide translation, support, feedback, audio, whereas that service is not provided for Indigenous languages. So when a department needs to figure out the wording for a poster or a speech or anything, they have to go out and find their own interpreter, translator. And that in itself can be problematic because there's nothing to regulate the quality of the translators and interpreters. There's nothing to standardize the cost or the payment for language. I could tell you my office cannot afford to get a lot of our documents translated because one person could charge 50 cents per word and another one can charge, different translator can charge $5 per word. So I still have not got a lot of my documents translated because of the inconsistency in the cost. But I do think that if the GNWT provides a central location where the departments can go and get documents and speeches and find translators all in one centralized location, I think that will help with the service provision in the Indigenous languages. And I do believe our public language speakers need to hear their language. So they can work on trying to learn their own language, they can work at home, but they're not going to start speaking publicly if they don't hear it as well. I do think the service provision in the Aboriginal languages is really important.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further comments or questions. Last chance, committee members, any final questions for the Commissioner? Seeing none. I just wanted to thank you, Ms. Gauthier, for making the time to engage with committee today and deliver this report. I'll give you the opportunity to make any closing comments if you want. Is there anything, if there's anything left that you want to say to the committee, I'll turn the floor over to you.
I stand by what I just said. I do think it's really important that the government institutions, courthouse, and legislative assembly really work on providing standardized services for the Indigenous languages. I think the government is already doing a great job with the Francophone, the French language. And I do think that the departments need to have a centralized location so consistent services is provided to the public. And we have to start looking at providing services in the Aboriginal languages in all regions.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner, and we appreciate you making the time to speak with us today. So that concludes the public portion of this meeting. So we're going to just take a quick second to move offline. If I can get a motion from a committee member to move back in camera, moved by Mr. Hawkins, or okay. We're going to close the hearing and just take a second to do that. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. I will now call, or good afternoon, actually. I'll call the meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations back to order. My name is Julia Morse. Of course, I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of this committee. So this afternoon, we're hosting a public meeting on the Northwest Territories Ombud Annual Report Review. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. So as a standing committee, it is our responsibility to review the statutory officer annual reports. So I would like to remind all members and our witness to please direct comments and questions to myself as chair. This helps keep the meeting organized and running smoothly. And please wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. This is mostly just so we can get the mics lined up by Mr. Ball in the booth there. So I'll ask members to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome. I'm Denny Rogers. I'm the member for Nuvik Lake.
Thank you. My name is Kate Reed. I am the MLA for Great Slave, and thank you for coming today.
Good afternoon. Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Center, and happy to be here.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I will now invite the Northwest Territories Ombud, Colette Langlois, to proceed with her presentation on her annual report and 2 special reports. The floor is yours, Ms. Langlois.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you committee members for making the time today to meet with me. It's always interesting coming back and meeting on these annual reports. I did literally just sign off on the copy for the 23-24 annual report on Sunday, so that's off with the graphic designer now. But there are some common themes. So I think this, and it's always useful to go back and look at previous reports and see where we've come from. So as members are aware, I think this, but I'll just go over it again because it may be new to people. This office is fairly new. The legislation was passed in 2018. The office opened in November of 2019. So it's just over 4 years that we've been in operation. I can't say that I've had a baseline year yet. I keep hoping that will happen, but we did have 2 years of COVID. We did have disasters in Hay River both last year and across the Northwest Territories as well the last 2 years. So, all of these things affect our operations and can affect the kinds of complaints we're getting. I will say across the country, there is a trend of both increasing volume of complaints. We think it's to do with just the state of people's mental health. Following the events of the last few years across the country, and here in particular with the natural disasters and weather-related events we've had. What that means for us, it means our complaints are more complex because people are coming to our office. They're already more agitated, more in distress, just more emotional than they would be otherwise. And, we deal with that. It sometimes takes more time for them to get their story out. It takes more time, more listening, to make sure that we're finding the right solutions for them or sending them to an appropriate referral. So all of that, even though the number of complaints is what it is, it doesn't always tell the whole story because even something that ends up being a referral in the end could take hours of research and discussion with the person to resolve. So the numbers are definitely an indicator, but they don't tell everything. What we're seeing with complaints across the years as well is that we're getting a better and better regional distribution. When we started out, I think it was 9% of complaints, for example, came from the Beaufort Delta region, and I'm talking about complaints that come from communities. There are some complaints that come from correctional centers, from outside the NWT or where we don't have a community. Those ones, like leaving those out, is what I'm speaking about. That's an underrepresentation. It shot up to about 15%, which is about the same as the population for that region as soon as we started doing outreach there. So it does have an impact, and we're getting better. Likewise, the South Slave, of course, was really high in the beginning. It's still higher than than one would expect from the population, but that's for the whole region. We get a lot of complaints as well from Fort Smith and Fort Resolution and some of the other smaller communities in the area, because Hay River tends to be a place people are passing through. They call it the hub, right? People come for shopping, for dentist appointments, different activities. So people will sometimes stop into the office or see our sign or think to call us just by virtue of passing through. So that's important. I think, one of the standards of fairness is accessibility, and we want to keep, it's a measure of accessibility if we're not getting complaints from across the territory, I think. I think it should be, there's all kinds of reasons why we might get more from one region than another, but generally there should be something that looks like the population and it shouldn't be really skewed. So all that's to say that is definitely improved since we first opened, and I hope that will continue to improve. So what stands out really for me with 22-23, as you'll remember, it's a short time ago, but that April of 22 was when the public health restrictions related to COVID ended. So that meant it was an open door for us to be able to go out and do in-person outreach activities. It meant that we could start thinking about doing some in-person training for public servants. So the outreach happened over the course of the year. I think that was very successful. We're seeing the results more in the 23-24 fiscal year of what that's meant for our complaint volumes. But we were able to get out to a number of communities and a number of events and promote the office in person. And what we see is there are a lot of people that are happy to just do everything online. They're happy if they can find the complaint form or the information on the website and send us an email, and then it's done, and they'll check their email later on. There are some people that really want to talk to a person or talk to someone that they've actually seen in person, or they know somebody who's met somebody from the office. The more we can do of that, the more it's just the culture here and what people are used to, particularly in smaller communities. It's sometimes really uncomfortable to cold call an office for help, to talk about something really sensitive and personal when you don't know who these people are at the other end of the line. So the more we can do that, the more we can either be somebody that somebody you trust in your community has met, if not you personally. I think the more accessible the service becomes, and accessibility is in itself a standard of fairness that we're trying to promote. So we want to be setting an example for that. So it was really nice to be able to start that work a little bit late in the mandate, but to be able to start it in 22-23 was really great. The other thing I really saw in 22-23 is that's where we were able to focus on some activities that I call collectively our prevention mandate. So as much as ombuds have a role of investigating complaints or trying to resolve complaints, dealing with individual concerns that people bring forward, I think the most, it's not more important, but more impactful part of the mandate comes from the things that we can do to prevent complaints in the first place. Given that this is a relatively new office for the territory, I think there's a lot of learning for the public service, just what these principles are. Some things they may be doing right, but might not have connected them to fairness. Some things, they might need to look at some long-standing practices. So there's been a real openness to doing that. So having that training that we launched towards the end of 22-23, I think was well received. That's a one-day workshop. We made it in-house because we could have just grabbed something from another jurisdiction, but we wanted it to be really relevant to Northern content. There's some hands-on interactive activities. That's why we do it in person. So, we hope that my staff have backgrounds in adult education. I don't. But we hope that helps people retain the information more because they're experiencing some things as well as just being talked at. The own motion investigations, I think, are we did 3 of them in 22-23, and I think those, though we get a lot of mileage from those. So when we do an investigation that's based on a complaint, it tends to be a much more narrow scope. We're really looking at what the complainant brought us. We do look at systemic issues, so we would consider, is this something that could be happening to other people, and if so, what would be the more systemic fix as opposed to what's needed to resolve this individual file. So we did some investigations like that in the previous year. With these own motion investigations, we can really look at trends that we're seeing across complaints and what is causing these things. So, and what can we do to, avoid getting some of these complaints in the first place. So income assistance was a really good example of that. That was the first own motion investigation we did. And that came out of just looking at our complaints and wondering, why are we getting so many complaints that really seemed to be about service? And we would have thought maybe they could have been resolved by the department more easily, but they weren't getting resolved. They were coming to us. And I think everybody found that report an interesting exercise, and the department was really receptive to it. They've made some changes as a result of it. It complemented some of the other work they were doing. And it's got a much broader impact across the system than if we were just looking at one individual complaint about a specific issue in a specific program. Those are important too. You know, we have a role, I think, in conflict resolution between citizens and government. It's not to say that's not also important. It is really core to what we do, but it's nice when we can have an impact and start seeing complaints declining. I don't get as many complaints about his income assistance as I did a couple of years ago, and I think some of the practices they've put in place is the result of that, as a result of that own motion. We had two other own motion investigations. So one was on records of employment. So that was just it's a concern that had come to our office a few times about the delays in getting those records of employment. That was a fairly straightforward investigation. We just looked at what the regulations said and what they were doing and provided some conclusions on that. And the third own motion, we didn't publish the full report, but there's a synopsis of it in here. That was, we looked at all the housing authorities' rules for tenants, just to make sure that they were complying with the Residential Tenancies Act and that there weren't any unfairness issues in the rules themselves. And the reason we did this as an own motion is, again, it came up kind of as a side issue in a couple of complaints we were looking at. The people who made the complaint weren't really interested in pursuing that issue. They had some other issues they wanted us to look into that we helped them with. And we thought, well, you know, we should really look at all of them rather than just one authority, because there could be issues. And we did find a few, and there were some policy changes made as a result of that. So those were the own motion investigations. The other piece we did on prevention, and this is something that ombuds across the country have been thinking a lot about following the pandemic, is long-term care facilities, because of some of the things that we saw happen in some jurisdictions that were pretty awful, and that have led to a number of ombud investigations across the country. So fortunately, we didn't see those kinds of impacts here in those numbers. But we do always want to be mindful that anybody who lives in a facility that's operated by public servants, everything, and that the other population, that would also include correctional employees. We just think like everything about their lives is affected by administrative decision-making and administrative procedure. So what they eat, the safety, what kinds of programs and activities they have access to. So it's just these are really special populations because they're vulnerable. And so we did a pamphlet specifically for that long-term care facilities, because we wanted to make people working in the facilities, residents and family members aware that this is also something that ombuds can look into. It's not just about decisions on applications and the more bureaucratic parts of what the public service does. As a part of that, we've now been to, we didn't get to them all in 22, 23, but all the long-term care facilities to have eyes on in person, because it's really helpful if we get a complaint to be able to imagine the space that might have happened in. And they're all, you know, there's a lot of differences between them. We also try to get to the correctional facilities as well, every couple of years or so, again, just to remind ourselves what the layout's like, where things are situated. So that would be the remarks I have on the annual report itself, except to say, as I noted in the message from the Ombud, again, I think the prevention mandate is really impactful. I am concerned about the staffing level. There we do have 2 staff. We're now seeing increased complaints and we're getting increased demand for the training. So these were all things we weren't doing during COVID. There's a lot that's been added to what the office offers. So, you know, I think if the staffing level doesn't change, some of that is what'll have to be scaled back, because we do need to keep responding to complaints. So just flagging that's a concern that we've had. So, Mr. Chairman, that's my comments on the annual report, and I'm open to whether I take questions on that now, or if the committee would like, I can move on through the other two reports.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Maybe I'll just put that to the committee. Do we want all three presentations at once, or do we want to do questions on the annual report first? Mr. Hawkins, you had your hand up?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. It would be my personal preference to take all three, and then, I mean, most of our questions probably bleed back and forth or whatnot, but we're more than capable hands between your chairmanship and the Ombud, so I figure we'll find our way through this without any problems.
Okay, thank you. Any concerns with that approach? Seeing none, if you want to move on, Ms. Langlois, with the other reports as well, and then we'll do questions at the end. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. So maybe I'll move on to the investigation updates report, because that ties in with some of the things I was speaking about in the annual report. So this, what it did is it went and revisited the first two investigation reports that we did in 2021, which led to some recommendations for authorities that were accepted. So this is an accountability exercise. We want to go back a little bit later and see what progress they're making on them. Because if they've said they're going to do it, you know, we want to make sure that just doesn't disappear somewhere. So this was the first time we did it, was last year, because enough time had lapsed between our first investigation reports. We started looking at this about 2 years, a little bit under 2 years in one case after the report had been made. This is something I envision would be an annual exercise. There's more reports now that we should be going back to check on recommendations. Maybe even more frequent. That will be up to the next Ombud. But it is something not all the other Ombuds offices practices, but I think it is a good practice to, you know, give these updates periodically. So the first investigation that we published a report on was about the Housing Corporation, and which is now Housing NWT. It was a personal complaint, so some of the issues that it raised were very file specific. There were some others that were more generalizable, and they had to do with things like client-centered or person-centered service, service standards, accessible information, and I mention that because these are themes that come up over and over again in different areas. So I was really happy to see the progress they've made on the recommendations. It is in the context of a much bigger exercise that they were doing, so in a way they've taken on actually a lot more than what the recommendations asked for, because our recommendations were specific to one of their regional offices and to one of their programs, and they're now looking at, they may have, I'm sure they've made more progress since then. They're looking at service standards, client focus across the organization. Client focus is one of the, I can't remember what they call it. It's one of their corporate values. Values might not be the right word for it, but it's definitely core to their operations now, and it's part of their strategic plan. I think they're within striking distance of completing the recommendations. So that's a really positive thing to see. And since that report, which was our first one, and I don't know if it may just be something that's coming from a lot of different directions, but I think that focus on person-centered or client-centered care is something that really aligns with the fairness principles. That's what's underneath a lot of this. And in really simple terms, it's think about what it would be like to be the person at the other end of the phone receiving your email across the desk from you, and act accordingly. It's not really complicated. Sometimes what it can involve is looking at procedures and processes for accessing services, because often they were designed to meet other requirements. So what works best for the staff, what makes the most sense for efficiency for the organization, what did the auditor require us to do? And it's not that those things aren't important too, but sometimes what gets lost in there is what it's like for the person who is the reason that this service exists in the first place, to navigate all the way through that. So if that's becoming more and more something that public service is thinking about, I think that's a really positive outcome. The second investigation, and I won't go into too many details because there's full reports on these investigations. It's more just an update. The second one was on the property assessment process and the tangle that it really gets into when we have people who are non-tenured occupiers of property. They're still liable to property taxation, but all those checks that come in when there's legal title transfer, you know, when I buy a house or sell a house, the lawyers look after the conveyancing. One of the things that gets dealt with in the adjustments is property taxes, whatever's owed, and there's a process for notifying the town that somebody else has taken over. None of that is there when a non-tenured habitant leaves a property and leaves it vacant. So there was kind of a gap in the system for MACA to be notified that nobody was there anymore. They kept sending the tax bills, and the person was getting more and more stressed about it, didn't understand how the system worked, and didn't know what to do about it. And you know, this situation happened. My biggest concern with that report, they did resolve the individual's file. That was resolved, but my concern was that there could be other people out there in that same situation that just kept getting these big bills and just didn't know what to do about them, and were just getting really stressed. So it was to try and identify who else might be out there. You know, where have you not gone back to, or where might there be properties that aren't being occupied anymore that are still getting taxed, and shouldn't be, because there's no improvements on there. It's just vacant land that nobody's on anymore. So that turned out to be an extremely complicated process because they have to work with lands. MACA has to work with them to get the information to be able to do the assessments, and then that feeds into finance, which is who does the taxation piece of it. So it involves 3 departments. The first step was they had to get an information sharing agreement together so they wouldn't be violating any privacy legislation. So it's a lot longer, it's a lot more involved than I think anyone would have hoped. I do think they're making some progress. I hope there's a lot more that's made by the time the next update report comes around, because I am concerned about people that might be out there. But one thing that did come of this is they did, you know, recognize that initially the response was, well, why didn't they just, you know, phone MACA in Yellowknife and tell us that they weren't there anymore? And it's like, well, how would they know to do that? You know, where's the information? So it did lead to some changes to the actual information that's provided to people. You know, it's rather than this, tiny font, long explanation on the back of the assessment notices. They were working on some more accessible material so people can actually understand what it means, and they don't need a magnifying glass to get through the process. So I think those pieces that were a little bit easier to do have been completed because they were near completion by the time we did the update report. But the bigger issue of trying to avoid this happening in the first place is still out there. So yeah, again, I think these are really important for accountability, that we go back. There's a few reports that we did in 2022 that it's probably time this year to go and look at those recommendations as well as checking in on these again. So this will be an ongoing process, I expect. That's all I had to say about the investigation updates report. The recommendations for amendments to the Ombud Act, I'll maybe just speak generally, and then I can speak to the individual recommendations as well. So in my first annual report, that was 2019-2020, right off the bat, I did identify some recommendations for changes to the legislation, just based on, reading the act, looking at how it compared to provincial territorial legislation across Canada, and seeing where there were some gaps or where we were doing things differently. One of the biggest issues I had pointed out in that one was that we had a finite list of authorities we could look into, and it meant that there were a lot that fell through the cracks that we couldn't do anything with. That got addressed in Bill 61, which passed last year and came into force in July. So along with a number of the other recommendations that I brought forward in 2019-20. So in this report, what I've done is take the ones that from 1920 that I still think are relevant. So I've put them in here, hopefully with maybe some more explanation than I had before. There are also a few new ones that have come up, so I'll maybe speak to them in turn. Some of them probably don't require too much explanation, so I'll try to not take up too much time with that. So the first recommendation is to extend the Ombud's jurisdiction to municipal governments, so cities, towns, villages, and hamlets. Specifically those types of governments, because I think it would be a whole other thing if we were looking at charter communities or any of the Indigenous governments. That's a negotiation that would need to happen, or definitely not something I would put in my report. The reason for this is, you know, we do get a lot of complaints about municipal governments. There's really nowhere to refer them to, other than back to the municipal government, try and work it out with them. It is in almost every other part of Canada, municipal governments are part of the Ombud's mandate, and I think there's good reason for that, because these are the services that people deal with the most when it comes to government. It affects daily life the most for a lot of people. You know, it's things that are directly in their community. They're definitely impacted by these services. All the same principles, you know, plain language communication, accessibility, writing clear decisions, dealing with things in a timely manner. I think they apply equally to those services. So I will, though, say that this is not something that I went out and consulted with municipal governments on. That's not my role. I mean, that's something that the department would do, the committee might do at some point if there was a bill brought forward. Immediately after the report was issued, I wrote to the NWT Association of Communities to provide that context for them. Like, look, this is just a recommendation I'm making based on past practice. This isn't going to happen. You know, it would have to go through a whole legislative process. So just to reassure them that's not what was there would be a lot of steps in between this coming into effect and possibly a lot of years too. Having said that, though, I did attend, as we generally do, the office does attend the NWT Association of Communities meetings. It's just a great opportunity for us to let municipal leaders know about the services we have. So if they have constituents that are having problems with territorial government, where we hope, you know, they'll think of referring people to us. It did come up in a couple of discussions. I didn't hear, you know, just a few people did come by and talk about it. For the most part, people were either neutral or positive about it. I think, you know, there is a concern it could lead to more work, but it is a bit different, and people were making comparisons to access to information and privacy legislation, which I know there's been interest in having that expanded to municipal governments as well. I think the difference with this is with access to information and protection of privacy, you need to have records management in place, and you need to have people who can respond to those requests. It takes more resources. With this, it's really, and you know, what I would say is it's more of a service to the municipal government as well as to residents, because it can be really difficult, even with the territorial authorities we deal with. When they have people who are constantly upset and complaining, it takes up a lot of staff time. It can be really demoralizing for staff, and sometimes these issues just go around and around and around, and they never get resolved. And what we're able to do in a lot of cases with territorial authorities is actually bring some closure to those things, even if it's just having an outside party say, actually, this isn't unfair. And here's why. That can really be helpful for everyone involved. So I would say, you know, in a lot of ways, it's more of a service to them than anything else that they would be asked to do in addition. But again, that's, you know, the recommendation is just based on what I think is best practice. The second recommendation, and this is something that did get discussed quite a bit in Bill 61, this has to do with the Human Rights Commission. So the Human Rights Commission is not under the authority of the Ombud to take complaints about them. We do get complaints, not a lot, but usually a few every year, and I don't want to suggest that they would be substantiated. They might be completely unfounded. But the fact is, we do get these complaints, and it is an important service, and there's no way for us to resolve them. We just have to send them back there. So it's very common in any organization that's providing services to get the kind of service type complaints that you would expect. They're not getting back to me, or I sent this in, I didn't hear back, it's taking forever. Generally those, if we were going to get any complaints about human rights, I would expect that's what those would be. And I'm kind of speaking about recommendations 2 and 3 together. So I'll go to the other part of this, which is that our legislation has a provision that doesn't allow us to investigate a matter within the jurisdiction of the Executive Director of Human Rights and the Human Rights Commission and the Adjudication Panel. And I think the intent with that is to avoid overlap or having confusion, but from our perspective, it creates actually a lot of difficulty in being really clear about what's within our mandate and what's not, because people can come and tell their story in one way and it sounds like an administrative fairness issue, and if they come and tell it another way, it sounds like it could be a human rights issue. And it's not clear from this how far we should be questioning them to see if there's a possible human rights complaint, or if they mention discrimination or racism or something like that, that we would refer it to human rights. So there is kind of some gray area that's created there that's difficult to navigate. So an example of that would be with income assistance, and these are, or any program, these are complaints that we've heard before. Somebody says, they want me to come in every month and bring my paperwork. It's really hard for me to get there. I have a disability. I don't have transportation. The sidewalks are icy. I can't walk there, with my disability. And I can't afford to be taking taxis all the time to go back and forth to the office to do these things in person. Is there not some way that I could resolve this through email? So a complaint like that, from my perspective, that's a classic ombudsperson complaint. What they want is to be able to get their paperwork in by email or some way that doesn't involve all this extra expense and difficulty for them because of their disability. So let's get that fixed and get it solved. Now, if they told us, I think my rights are being violated, this is discrimination against me because I have a disability, absolutely, we would say, okay, then go talk to the Human Rights Commission. That's definitely something that you should find out more about. Or really, any income assistance related complaint could be discrimination on the basis of social condition. But it's really hard for me to figure out what the legislation is asking me to do in that situation. Should I just not deal with their issue about the paperwork and send them to human rights because they mentioned that they have a disability? Or, it's tricky. So, I think from the perspective of human rights, I think probably just reading their submissions on Bill 61, I think they're looking for certainty as well, right? They're concerned about what if I make findings and, would they have impact on them? They wouldn't, because I don't make binding orders. There is one jurisdiction, so generally, this is left open because it's best practice to refer people to other places anyway, right? If somebody's raising something that could be racism or human rights, and I think, that's something, we would want them to go talk to human rights anyway. If they have an issue with workers' compensation, we want them to go talk to the workers' advisor anyway. That's not in the legislation, but we want to send them there first. And there's a whole long list of processes that we would refer people to first. But I think, if it is seen that there's a need to have something in the legislation that sets a boundary, the way New Brunswick did it is if something is actively being investigated by the Human Rights Commission or has been investigated by the Human Rights Commission, that would be outside the scope of the ombudsperson. And I think that's, it's clear, right? We know where the line is. From my perspective, I don't know that it's necessary, but it does create that certainty for us because I can know for sure if something is investigated or not, or if it's under investigation or not, or I can find that out. Whereas I can't, it could be something under the jurisdiction. I don't know. That's asking for an analysis that's really difficult to do when we have complaints in front of us. So how this ties in with number 3, and I will just say as well, I included the whole appendix to the report because there was a lot of paper exchanged during Bill 61, and I just wanted to make sure that was on the record, that there was some response to those concerns that were raised, because otherwise, it gets lost. So it's just to have that available, because it did get into quite a detailed discussion. I didn't want to put all that content in the report and try to keep it simple, but just to have that background there. How 2 and 3 tie together is one of the other issues with that provision, regardless of whether the substance were to change or not. It's really confusing for people, because some people think that provision says I'm not allowed to investigate the Human Rights Commission, and some people think it means I'm not allowed to investigate matters like the Human Rights Commission itself, its services. Those are two separate issues, whether the Ombud can investigate the Human Rights Commission's offices itself, like their practices, and whether they can investigate issues that could be referred to the Human Rights Commission. So I would suggest the legislation just needs to be made clearer from that perspective, so it's not confusing people what that provision actually means, because right now it seems to be pretty unclear. Yeah, and there's much more detail in that in the appendix, so I don't want to spend too much more time on that one. Number 4, that's a fairly technical thing. It's that provision. I've always found it really strange that they refer to judicial review in the Act. It isn't in any other legislation. I can't find anything in Hansard or any of the things I looked at from when the legislation came in that explains why they would restrict the Ombud from looking into matters that could be subject to judicial review. So yes, it is absolutely standard practice that Ombuds don't look at things where there could be an appeal or review process. We don't want people to lose out on a process. If there's 30 days to appeal, and they defer that because they're making an Ombud complaint, they would lose out on their appeal. So absolutely, but judicial review, really you can judicially review, you could ask for judicial review of almost any government action or inaction or decision. So that, again, is just really ambiguous. If I were to take that to the most extreme literal interpretation, I would say, well, I have to wait 30 days before I do anything for any complaint, because you could decide to take it to judicial review or apply for judicial review. So I don't know why that wording's there. If it's, I don't know what it was trying to get at. There's some other wording I've suggested that is in some of the other provincial legislation that may be what they were trying to get at with that. That would be a review on the merits of a decision. That makes sense to me. But, somebody could literally apply to judicial review. I want the court to order them to phone me back because they haven't phoned me, answered my message that I left last week, right? Like, nobody would do that because it's really expensive, but theoretically that's a legal possibility. So again, it's just something, and it's not something that you would open up the whole Act to do, but if you were, making some of the other changes, it's something that could be addressed at the same time. Number 5, that was, again, like 4, it's also a recommendation I made in 1920, and that is to clarify the Ombud's power to get information from authorities during an investigation. So there are some pieces of so there is, of course, Access to Information and Protection of Privacy, Health Information Act. There's case law and also the legislation. If you read the provisions together, it's fairly clear how those work together. There are some other confidentiality provisions in other legislation, for example, income assistance. The child welfare legislation is another one. And, it makes authorities nervous. They don't want to give us information if they're violating confidentiality provisions, and it's sometimes hard to tell how those work together. Almost all the time, we can get around that because we get people to sign consent forms. We take complaints over the phone because that's easier for most people. We don't make people submit a complaint form, but if we're going to do something with a complaint and we're going to have to ask for personal information, we have a form we send them and say, can you just sign this and send it back? It says that we're allowed to talk to the department. That way I can reassure departments, yes, we have this permission, we have them sign this, we have a form letter we send to them if they ask questions. Most of them are used to working with us now. They know we do that, so they don't ask for it every time, but it's there, and I'm glad they're asking the question because it's really important, the privacy and confidentiality. So that provision is something that's in other provincial legislation. I've put all the references are in the report, so I think it is something that should be considered again because it could lead to some challenges down the road. The health information, there is some case law on that, but it's some of the authorities are uncomfortable working with us on some of these issues, and in health information you could easily have somebody who's doesn't have capacity to give consent, right? They might be deceased, they might be have a health condition that disables them from being able to work with us, and it may be a family member working on their behalf. So we want to make sure that those aren't impeding investigations. Number 6, that was also a recommendation from 1920. So this is a standard provision in jurisdictions that provide explicitly for informal complaint resolution. So all jurisdictions do informal complaint resolution. There's no jurisdiction that does an investigation of every complaint they get. But it's only in Saskatchewan, our legislation, and now Prince Edward Island, which is newer than us, where there is a possibility, it's put right in the Act, informal investigations, and there's encouragement to do that. Because of the way it changes some things structurally with the Act from how other jurisdictions do it. So other jurisdictions do informal resolution under their investigation powers. They have the ability to consult with the agencies and authorities at any time, so that's how they do their informal resolution. They're using that power. For us, it's separate from the investigation power. So why this matters is there's all these provisions in the Act that go along with an investigation that protect public servants who are providing materials that we're requiring them to provide. And my point is, if we're asking them nicely as part of an informal resolution to give us some documents, that's not the same as requiring them as we would under an investigation where we can compel documents. So I'm just concerned that that doesn't provide enough, there's no one situation that's happened. I have to think about worst case scenarios, but I think it would be really helpful there certainly have been situations where it would have been helpful for us to say to public servants, look, the Act clearly says if you give us information voluntarily, you're allowed to do that. You're protected. You're not going to be, you're not going to be in violation of your oath of office or confidentiality by doing that. The policy is people want you to cooperate with us. It doesn't come up in some of the other provincial statutes because everything is under their investigation framework, but it does in PEI in Saskatchewan. And I have talked to my colleagues about both of these provisions, 6 and 7. And, I said, is this really important? Do we really need this? And they were like, yeah, it's something that we refer to quite commonly. I just think it's a good thing for public servants to have, just that reassurance that working with us is not going to get them into trouble, because it shouldn't. Number 7, this is a newer one. Just because we've gone from having a list of authorities that we can use to a more open category where as long as they're, created in a certain way or have a certain number of members appointed by the GNWT, there are more authorities that fall under us. There's a definition of administrative head. That's quite important. That's the person we have to contact about an investigation. That's the person we have to provide our reports to. So we have to have absolute clarity with each authority that we're dealing with who that is. So it's deputy ministers for departments. It's CEOs where there's a CEO. Anytime there's an authority that doesn't have somebody with one of those titles, we have to write to the minister and ask them to tell us who's their administrative head. So it could potentially, sometimes it takes a few weeks for them to get back to us. We try to anticipate that, so I've got a number of them on file already, but if we miss one, we don't want to be waiting, telling a complainant they have to wait, 6 weeks because they're thinking about who the contact is going to be for the organization. And most jurisdictions aren't that prescriptive. They're just, executive director, or just, they just say the administrative head and don't even define it, because usually you can tell, you can anticipate who that would be. Number 8, that is one that does actually concern me some. It's a strange oversight because it's in every other piece of legislation, and that's protecting the information that comes out of Ombud investigations from being used in other proceedings. So practically, for example, somebody couldn't take the Ombud report and submit it as a court document and have the courts consider that, or evidence that, or ask the Ombud to provide evidence that from their complaint and have that show up in court, because confidentiality is really important. Like we're not working in an adjudicative process. We have to be able to resolve these things outside of that. Now, practically, it's kind of impossible anyway, because, or not impossible, but it probably isn't going to happen anyway, because we're not compellable. So I can't be called to testify, and my staff can't be called to testify or swear an affidavit confirming the authenticity of the report or explaining how I got to my recommendations. So I think it makes the value of any of those documents less useful, but they shouldn't really be showing up there anyway. It's not necessarily that it would be my office providing them, for example, because, departments and agencies would have copies of letters from my office, copies of reports, copies of, different documents relating to an investigation. So it shouldn't be, this is meant to be outside of that process, and it could create some concerns down the road. The ninth one, this is something that my understanding is the board, this is something that the Board of Management would have to bring forward. It's not one that would deal so much with the substance of the act. My understanding is they were talking about this towards the end of the last legislative assembly, but I haven't seen any legislation come forward, so that's why it's being repeated again. It's just to ensure the independence of the office. It's another strange provision that doesn't exist anywhere else, and it makes it sound like the Office of the Clerk would have possibly some authority over our policies. So we don't want to. We want to make sure our investigation process is independent of that. And the last recommendation, it's a new recommendation. So the French title is Protecteur du Citoyen, which translates roughly as Citizen Protector. That is the same title as the Ombud has in the province of Quebec. Never really thought much about it, except I've recently gotten some comments from Francophone, French-speaking residents of the territory that did this mean that they couldn't use the Ombud because they're not Canadian citizens, they're permanent residents or here as temporary workers. So that's absolutely not the case, and I don't know how many, but I heard it more than once from more than one person. So it really concerns me that might be there. I don't think that's what was intended, and so it may be a good idea to reconsider that title. Although in Quebec it is Protecteur du Citoyen, there are a number of cities in Quebec that have ombudsmen, and they're called ombudsmen. In New Brunswick, it's the same as us. We're the Ombud, and the French title is also Ombud. The title ombudsman is the same in Manitoba as well, and other bilingual provinces. So it's not that Ombud or ombudsman would not be an acceptable term in French. It's used in other scenarios. The citizen protector, it also, it's a bit of nuance, but it suggests a role that's maybe a bit different from the way ombuds work here. We're not adversarial. That's more of a European model where they also have human rights as part of their mandate. I think where it really is set up to protect as a protection thing. This is more, we always say we speak up for fairness. So we're not on anybody's side. We're on the side of fairness. And that impartiality is really important. So that is my remarks on that. I will say, I have offered in the past, and as long as I'm around, I would be happy to do a more technical briefing on the amendments, to whether it's to justice staff, whether it's to your committee staff. I'm open to however I can assist with that. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience with all three reports.
Okay, thank you. Those were very comprehensive reports, I must say, and that's appreciated. I'll turn it over to committee's members now for questions. I see Mr. Hawkins is first.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the Ombuds being here. How much more of an enjoyable discussion it is in person. So that we do these things. I'm not anti-Zoom or anti-conference call, but the problem is it's It's a different type of dynamic conversation. So I do appreciate you being here. The other thing is, I want to point out, this is my second time reviewing a report because I sit on the Board of Management, and I don't know if I said anything the previous time, but I certainly want to make sure it's at least on the record, especially considering you're on your last little bits. We're lucky to keep you as long as we can. It's very good and comprehensive, so I hope this becomes a standard. Others consider the format. I'm not suggesting other commissioners need to make it identical, but you have a lot of things that you really wade into and flesh out important information. So I appreciate the way you take your approach, and perhaps you know, things can reflect similar formats, because I like how you do it, and I think it's very helpful. With respect to your recommendations, I just want to do a drive-by run through and maybe give you a chance to comment if you wish to comment back. So I'm going to work backwards. Item number 10, making a singular name that's maybe commonly understood. I mean, you know, in the old days we used to say chairman, and now we say chair. And yeah, I mean, times have changed, and respectfully for very good reasons. And I never would have thought about it till you pointed out that, you know, protect the citizens. Well, never thought about it. Yeah, and I suppose if you're a foreign citizen or temporary worker, et cetera, or you don't have your PR, you have your PR, but you don't have your nationality, you may be feeling that you don't matter as much. And so I can appreciate the fact that that would be wrong in the sense of that. That's good. Number 9, I'm just going to run through them really quickly from my observation. Yeah, it almost seems weird that there would be a secondary oversight of the clerk's office. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I mean, this, you know, it just gives me pause for thought, which is, does that apply anywhere else? And if so, why or how? And hence a fairness as well, you know? So in some ways, I hope we're you may be the Office of Fairness, I hope we're the Committee of Fairness, you know, in that sense. So it's an insert. I can't say how I'd end up on it, but it's a great observation. I'm glad you brought that forward. Disclosure, and it's interesting because in a day and age of everything's about process and procedure, I can tell you through, although I won't give you a specific example because we're not here to talk about that, but I can tell you asking people for the simplest signature or whatnot, people get hesitant about responsibility and being involved, and they're nervous about taking responsibility for something. So I can appreciate the public service having some very great stress about if someone from the Ombud's office calls and says, hey, can I have this information? And even though they have every right to provide it, there's this nervousness of feeling that they may be in trouble or whatnot, or reporting line or whatnot, and they want to get it off the table quickly to say, well, either make me or tell someone to make me, you know, like, because they want to feel protected. So I can appreciate that very much. Number 9, administrative head. Yeah, that's pretty, yeah, I mean, it almost seems funny. Sometimes when you see these things, it almost seems as if it kind of causes you to wonder why, you know, like how confusing it could be. So it makes sense. I'm just flipping through a couple of these. I just wanted to do a quick drive-by. The confidentiality one's a different, interesting one, I thought. I may not go through all of these, by the way, or in complete order, but the confidentiality one is interesting because, you know, in some ways I think to myself, like, I can appreciate that. And I know as an MLA, although not exclusively, but I'll say generally speaking, I've refused anonymous complaints, but I'll take them confidentially. In other words, I want to feel that there's substance to them and they're not just a drive-by smear and I'm not saying anonymous complaints aren't factual either. It's just how they're treated and the risk you take advocating and whatnot. And I can appreciate confidentiality in the nature as described here, but I would also wonder about how evidence is compelled. And you mentioned, and I would have known that information. It's just if somebody voluntarily provides information that says they were doing something inappropriate, that then itself becomes a fact. Although this is your area of training, schooling, and experience more than mine, it's just it would just seem odd. Yeah, I mean, it's lastly, Mr. Chairman, the 2 other areas is the human rights section. And you mentioned something sort of on the cuff, although you didn't make it sound like a standalone point in the sense of stop and think about this. But it's interesting because the way you were describing this, the way I read it, made me wonder. I'm almost curious as to why, with distinct functions clearly, but why the 2 wouldn't almost be married after some of the things you mentioned, how they could be. No, wait a minute, let's go across the hall and say this is your area of the division. In other words, one roof or one shingle looks at things, but separately in the sense of separately and independently. listening to your observation, and that's right. Like, I mean, sometimes people may not know where they belong just because they add one word as an adjective to describe their observations, but it wasn't the primary issue of why they were there. In other words, as you pointed out, someone wants to go submit their work but can't do it in their wheelchair, and they don't want to do it. They'd rather file. It's not the wheelchair that's the problem. It's just the process could be more convenient, and hence the wheelchair example. You get caught up as maybe that's the issue, whereas maybe it's they really just want a different way of doing business, and so it's interesting. And the last part is I would only exercise under number 1, which is the municipal issue, bit of caution in the sense of I think it makes sense, but the problem I've experienced over my time is be careful of how we download things and expect things. So the extent of reaching out or providing support and assistance is probably very important. I mean, I would almost jokingly say I think your office needs to also have a counselor involved in the sense of, because I'm sure some of the complaints you receive, and you would be the expert of this area, is things are about relentless frustration and exhaustion and, oh my God, I'm just going to go to the ombudsman. And really, sometimes I suspect, personally I don't know, but I suspect some of them are about emotional frustration and exhaustion about being told no and not told why no, or they just don't understand the answer that they're given, the right answer, but just don't say, it doesn't resonate properly. So I could only see that the taking municipal issues to you folks could cause more frustration, but at the same token is how are we going to, and I'm overlapping this, is how do we now address the municipality addressing this concern, in other words, supporting it and being involved in it. And by all means, I think citizens deserve fairness there. That's not what I'm getting at. Is just be careful how far we expand these things, because then if we do, then we have an obligation of expanding the support and resources to be able to do that. So in other words, just telling the town or city or hamlet, it's your job to figure out how to do this, and we're now creating hundreds of thousands of dollars of more work for you, just by an addition to the extension of the mandate. So, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to give my individual thoughts on some of the recommendations. Again, I think they're thorough and speaks to the competency of the Ombud we have, and I'm very grateful for her time there. So no specific question other than I thought they were very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Would the Ombud like to respond to any of that, or just take it as information?
I can take it as information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have any follow-up, or do you want to just leave your comments as that for now?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. Unless something stirs that I have a specific question, I'll get in the queue as appropriate. But I just wanted to say I enjoyed the recommendations and the comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Reid, I have you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for your very thorough presentation. Ooh, and the table is falling apart on me. I am curious about the investigation updates recommendations, and I'm sorry I'm not as familiar with your act as you are, but I was wondering if, since you are an interim commissioner, as you have formally resigned your post and we're waiting to staff, is there interest for your office to see committee look into those recommendations specifically, or would you like your the person coming into your shoes to take that mantle? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep, to the Ombud.
So I think, how committee wants to use these reports is really up to committee. I mean, from our point of view, it's the thing is to just not let the recommendations disappear. And I think I do want to say I think authorities have been pretty diligent in following up on the whole, where they said they follow up. I think that's part of our role post-investigation to be monitoring these things. We do have, if we had to, we could invoke our investigation powers and actually go and, start gathering documents again and interviewing witnesses in a much more formal way to follow up on this. So I think the actual follow-up on the reports in terms of reporting and letting people know what's happened, I think that's a role for the office, and the next Ombud will decide how they want to carry that out or if they want to continue this forward. Yeah.
Thank you. No follow-up? Okay. Mr. Rogers, I have you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. A couple of quick comments and then one question. First of all, yeah, great annual report. I echo Mr. Hawkins' comments. The format's clear, easy to read, gives an excellent understanding of what the Ombud does, and I think that's very important when you have an annual report that's going to the public, and a really good job on that. So congratulations. I assume and hope you're sticking around and available to assist the new Ombud to come in to ensure that, as Mr. Hawkins has said, that we continue to get that good reporting. On the recommendations, and as I read through them, and as I listened to the explanations on and why they're in there, I can't think of a reason at this point. Obviously, committee will discuss to not recommend those recommendations move forward. I think the work's been excellent on there. I think it makes sense. So I just wanted to say that as I went through. With the, I guess one caveat on that, obviously, and you did mention this, that anything to do with the municipalities, obviously you would further consult, or the Ombud would further consult with the NWT Association of Communities. I think it's very important that anything we're doing there with that group, that we engage them. One question, it's an easy one, I'm sure. Going through your table on your complaints received, there was one in there, I believe it said alternate processes. So I'm assuming alternate process would mean the relative authority of whatever body that they have an issue with, or the Human Rights Commissioner, or if you're not taking the complaint but referring them to, I guess, an alternate process. What are those alternate processes?
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. To Ms. Langlois.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we're referring them back to the authority, there's a category referred back to the authority. So if it's something that a manager or somebody within the authority would be able to deal with, that's called referred back to the authority. So if it's an alternate process, it would be something outside of the authority. So human rights is an example. I'm just trying to think of some others. Another one that comes up a lot is grievances that employees have, and we would say the union would be the correct process for that. So that would be another common referral that we'd make. There's a few of them out there that come back over and over, but those are two that spring to mind. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you. Follow-up to Mr. Rogers.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, there was about 20 of those, I just noticed, but no other follow-up other than, again, great job and appreciate the Ombud's time today.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other burning questions from the committee? Okay, I'll give Mr. Hawkins a second to think about it, but I'll ask a question of my own. I just wanted to kind of dig in a little bit. You were mentioning, staffing and the fact that you guys are effectively at capacity right now, and it seems to me that you're recommending that even additional resources would be appreciated. I wonder just if you have any other comments you'd like to get on the record regarding that. I'd be interested to hear them.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. So, ultimately, I realize it's a decision of the Assembly, the budgets, and there's a lot of different priorities across government. So I do get that. It's just more to signal that, because there's this demand for the training, there's more possibility of doing outreach and these things. I hope I've explained why they're important too, that more preventative approach. We may not be able to do as much of that if we're at the resources that we have now, because we are getting really saturated with complaints at the moment. So we did have 3 staff in 22-23. That made a huge difference for us. That's what allowed us to actually develop that training manual, because we had an extra person that could do some of the background research for us, was able to go out on the road and deliver the training with one of the officers, was able to go to an outreach event, because it's most of these we don't want to be sending just one person to have them trying to deliver training on their own. It's really works out a lot better with 2. So yeah, and to do all the planning and logistics that goes along with that. Like, we weren't doing any travel for 2 years. Nobody was taking holidays. So all we were really doing was complaints and putting out radio ads and writing pamphlets. So in this last year, 22-23, that's where we really saw an explosion of activity. So yeah, that's that's the, I guess that's the comments I would make. Is, if we don't have additional resources, I'm not sure we'll be able to keep up with the demand for training or do as much outreach as we should, or take on these own motion investigations that are pretty resource intensive, because I always have to balance, and the next Ombud will also have to balance, we want to be responding to people that are taking the time to make complaints to us too, and we can't have all our resources tied up doing own motion investigations. We have to have that capacity as well.
Okay, thank you. I do have another one. Just on the topic of the expanding mandate to municipalities, have you heard from mayors or otherwise, or officials from municipalities, that there's a desire on their end to see services extended to municipalities from the Ombud's office?
Not in a formal way, Mr. Chair, like I haven't received a letter or anything, but from the discussions at the NWTAC, there were a couple of mayors that said, yeah, absolutely, we should be doing this, and a couple that had some hesitation. So I think there's probably mixed. I don't think people have a lot of information about it. I do want to clarify, I don't think it's the Ombud's role to do consultation, like just given the timing of the report and the fact the NWTAC was happening after that, I just had put it out there, like if anybody is trying to understand what I was getting at, I'm here, like I can kind of explain how it works in other places, but the consultation part, I really don't see that as my role. It's just something what I hoped with this recommendation is that it would start the discussion, because I do think it's a good idea, and I think, or I wouldn't have put it in here, but I think it's a good idea that people, to have people start talking about it, because I know these things can take a long time to get through. So just to have the conversation start, I think is what I hoped would come out of this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Last question. I just wanted to ask, as you're kind of leaving the office, are you satisfied so far with how the territorial public bodies have been engaging with your office? Do you find that they're providing timely responses? Do they respond to your suggestions in a timely fashion? If you have any comments on that, I'd appreciate hearing them.
Yeah, I would say on the whole, I'm actually really impressed with the responsiveness of the public service. I think they were really open to, and continue to be really open to hearing about how they can improve their programs and services. In a lot of cases, they're looking for solutions too, and we're able to provide some advice to them. The investigations aren't adversarial, they're very collaborative. For example, with a complaint-based investigation, it's really framed by the complaint, but when we do own motion investigations, I'll typically have some conversations with the authorities ahead of time. It's like, look, we think we need to do this. What are some things that would help you, that you don't know, that we might be able to look into as part of this? Or is there anything else you can think of that would help you to do your job? Because if you think of, particularly the investigations when we're working with frontline workers, they don't always have access to the deputy minister or the CEO, right? There's a lot of layers of management in between those two, so the information might not be making its way up there. So sometimes there's insights that can come for that the department or the authority would have a hard time getting in other ways. So there's been a huge receptiveness to working with us on that. I think generally, when we first started, there was some defensiveness, and I still get that sometimes. People don't like being told that they're not, something isn't what it should be, or they, the criticism can sting sometimes. But I think I see less and less in that as people are seeing, I never set out to embarrass authorities or shame people. The point is always, let's try, is there a problem here? And if there is, let's find a solution. And I know there's a lot of interest in the fairness training that we've started. There was just an announcement on BareNet a couple weeks ago. They're finally going to make the Fairness 101, that was kind of the stopgap training. I was able to get this 1-hour webinar that BC Ombudsperson offers put into our GNWT training calendar. So that's now required for supervisors and managers. So there is definitely receptivity to it. Occasionally, if it's a smaller authority or an authority that we haven't dealt with so much, that tends to be a longer, more drawn-out process, and we have to explain a lot of things to them, and sometimes they're reticent about getting us information. But on the whole, the ones that we deal with more often, I think it's really been a positive relationship all around, you know, because I hope when I go into a meeting of public servants that if I say, you know, who's here to make public service better, they're all putting up their hands, and somebody's like, well, not me. I mean, we're all on the same side, right? We're trying to, that's what we're here for. So, you know, it's focusing on our common interests. And you know, I do try to be reasonable, you know, recognizing how behind how much workload there is responding to, you know, different requests from different areas. You know, we don't want to overload organizations asking for more information than we need to. So, you know, there is some, you know, I'm always open to discussing process with them to see if we can, you know, make things work in a way that will work for them as well as for us and still meet our requirements. So, yeah, it's as I said, it's not adversarial. That doesn't mean they always like what we have to say, but I think it's on the whole a really positive response that we've had to the legislation. You know, and compared to, you know, and there's some jurisdictions where there's a lot of litigation that happens with the Ombud's office. You know, it's not. I think, you know, I'm really happy that this is the situation here. It's been a really good environment for me to and for the office to start off in and grow in, you know, that there's been this receptivity, because it's not something I ever take for granted, and I don't think anybody should, because it can change. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will just give committee a last ditch. Okay, I'm seeing no further comments from committee, so just to close out, I just wanted to thank you very much for the report. Similar to my colleagues here, I was very impressed with the comprehensiveness of the report, and I must say it's very clear to me that you've kind of approached this role with a lot of passion and a lot, you know, an above average level of competency, and I think it's a big loss for us that you're moving on. So I just wanted to express my thanks to you for the work that you've done. You've definitely set a high bar, and I certainly hope that we can find someone that can at least in part fill your shoes. So thank you very much for your presentation to the committee. And with that, I think we are concluding the public portion of this meeting. Thank you.